Hello, how are you this week? I am Dorothy Wallace, Parish Minister at Westloch Fineside, and you are most welcome. We begin with the words from James at chapter 1, verses 17 to 27, and then we look at Mark chapter 7, verses 14 and 15, and then 21 and to 23. Every generous act of giving with every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. In fulfillment of his own purpose, he gave us birth by the word of truth, so that we would become a kind of first fruits of his creation. You must understand this, my beloved. Everyone be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. For your anger does not produce God's righteousness. Therefore rid yourself of all sordidness and rank growth of wickedness, and welcome with meekness the implanted word that has the power to save your souls. But be doers of the word, and not merely hearers who deceive themselves. For if any are hearers of the word and not doers, they are like those who look at themselves in a mirror. For they look at themselves, and on going away, immediately forget what they were like. But those who look into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and persevere, not being hearers who forget, but doers who act, they will be blessed in their doing. If any think they are religious and do not bridle their tongues but deceive their hearts, their religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to care for orphans and widows in their distress, and to keep oneself unstained by the world. On another occasion he called the people and said to them, "Listen to me, all of you, and understand this. Nothing that goes into a person from outside can defile him. No, it is the things that come out of a person that defile him. From inside, from the human heart, comes evil thoughts, acts of fornication, theft, murder, adultery, greed and malice, fraud and indecency, envy, slander, arrogance and folly. All these evil things come from within, and they are what defile a person." Praise be to God for these holy words. That passage from James reminds me of a speaker I heard a few years ago, particularly the phrase about he who listens but does not act on the gospel. This speaker had arrived that morning by train to Waverley Station and told us of his custom when he arrived from his rural parish to any of our Scottish cities. He would get off the train, buy 2 coffees or soup or tea, a couple of sausage rolls, and find the first homeless person he met, offer them the picnic, and if they seemed willing, asked if he could sit with them and have a chat. He didn't like to just toss money into their empty polystyrene cup, not make eye contact and then move on. He knew from his dealings with the homeless that the lack of food and warmth, the lack of security and shelter, horrendous as they were not always the worst aspect of homelessness, of life on the streets. The worst thing was often the loneliness, the isolation, the dehumanising effect that people walking by, avoiding your eye, tossing a few crumbs from their salary your way, with not a word. The contempt was horrendous, but the feeling like they didn't exist, even worse. So this speaker offered so much more than a few coins and a hot meal. He offered fellowship, a friendly ear, someone who listened, someone who valued them, who saw them as a fellow human, not just an embarrassing encounter littering up the streets with their very existence. This speaker, a Church of Scotland minister, did not preach one thing on a Sunday and then do the opposite on a Monday. He didn't preach and teach the gospel, then go off into his life and live a different reality, an opposite reality. He lived his preaching. He lived his gospel. This morning's gospel reading has probably never been so relevant. Maybe perhaps during the plague, But we have learned, certainly over the past year in this age of COVID-19, that we can be very much physically defiled by not washing our hands. In the early days of the pandemic, we learned that we should even keep from touching our faces. I'd love to know how many people stopped biting their nails in 2020. But even in the first century, it must have been preferable to eat with clean hands, especially since so much of their food was eaten with their hands. They might not have known about different bacteria, but they would have had an idea that clean hands were important. So what is Jesus saying? Is he trying to encourage eating with dirty hands? No, of course not. The Pharisee, however, are not interested in keeping illness and disease at bay, or indeed cleanliness for its own sake. They are only interested with ritual cleansing, with tradition, with an outward sign of faith. But Jesus is making a point to the scribes and the Pharisee. It's not what is outside, but what is in your own heart that defiles you. Things cannot be religiously unclean, only persons. Jesus warns them that when we place human tradition over God's directions, our hearts become wicked. He gives us a substantial list in verses 21 to 23, teaching that these terrible things do not come from washing our hands, but they come from within our own hearts. For it is the unclean heart that defiles us. Dirty hands, nasty stains and smells can be got rid of, they can be scrubbed, or nowadays they can be bleached away. What comes from within is more difficult to remove. Our inner defilement is the problem. And these are some of the rather tough words to swallow: wickedness, defile, murder, slander, adultery, and the list goes on. All the really nasty bad things. We could very easily skim right over the words with the thought, well, I don't do any of these things. But try instead to keep it a bit more simple and ask yourself, am I really honouring God with my lips, while my heart is in fact dishonouring him? This is an opportunity to bring hearts into line with our traditions. I mentioned before my love of William Barclay, and now how I've not been quoting him much recently, but I'm reverting back to type today. Barclay speaks of those who come into church, hear the word preached, sing along the hymns, join in with responses and prayer. They hear the words, so this makes them Christians. But we need to not just hear. We need to turn that we hear into actions. We are justified by faith, indeed, but we cannot play lip service to our faith. James the Apostle did not dispute Paul's declaration that justification, salvation was through faith alone, but rather James teaches that true faith will make us wish to do good things. Good works will follow true faith. We will have the grace to speak to beggars, to wash the feet of the homeless, to care for widows and orphans. We need to, as Christ did, as Christ gave us the perfect example, we need to live out our gospel. Barclay says that here, we must take what we hear in the kirk and live it in the marketplace. We are being the doers that James speaks of. The Bible tells many stories about widows and orphans. I'm thinking of Elijah and the widow, where Elijah appears to take the widow's last amount of oil and flour, only to have her blessed, to have an overabundance for this woman. Jesus himself encounters a widow and restores life to her only child. During biblical days and very far beyond, a woman without a man was doomed to a life of poverty and destitution. So this passage makes it clear to us that true religion, true authentic worship, has nothing to do with what you give to the church, how much you give, or how prestigious your position is, but how you treat the widow and the orphan, or the least of those among you. And I'm thinking back to a couple of weeks ago when Luke told of Lazarus and the rich man. The rich man was not condemned because he was rich. There is no harm in being well off. Rather, he was condemned for ignoring the poor, for not helping those he encountered who could benefit from a helping hand. He was condemned for his indifference, for walking by the beggars. The passage in James also reminds us that words matter. It's not only what we say that matters, but how we speak our words. When we speak with rage, we are hurtful and we are dehumanising ourselves as well as the other person. When we're living out the word of truth, when we hear the gospel, hear what God requires of us, and when we take our gospel learning into the marketplace, into the workplace, into the leisure place, when we take our gospel learning into the often busy roads in our parish, we are aware when our words become weapons. We are aware when the widow and the orphan among us needs our truth and support. When we offer not just a few coppers, but more importantly, a friendly word for the homeless on the streets. When we offer the true hand of fellowship, when we listen and do, then we become the givers of the true gospel, the givers of the true gift from God. Praise be to God. We listen now to Wilf, who will perform Pavane by Fauré, and then we will unite in prayer. God of impeccable timing, help us to synchronise our inner clocks with the rhythm of your spirit. If we are always the first to speak, help us to hold back and listen sometimes. If we are hesitant to say what we think, give us confidence to speak. If we are natural Marthas, happiest when we are busy working, slow us down and teach us to rest a while. If we are dreamy Marys living in our heads, oblivious to practical need, put an apron around our waist and give us something useful to do. If we bury our anger so that it eats us up inside, teach us safe ways to show how we feel. If we are easily combustible, exploding and then forgetting, not noticing the collateral damage, teach us self-control. Most of all, if we think that our way is the only way to be, that our way of believing is right and everyone else is wrong, that our way of living out the gospel is the only one that pleases you, then teach us humility and keep us out of harm's way until we remember that the only law that matters is the law of love. Amen. Thank you for joining us this week, and thank you to Wilf for his contribution. We will be back next week, and until then, stay safe.